Thank you very much, and thank you to you all. I'm very keenly aware that that some of you are way past midnight at this point. So thank you very much for your participation. Professor White, you are referring to safety in a lot, and I think for the purposes of our record and our discussion, it's important for us to begin by defining what safety means and what you mean, because I think depending on our various ethical perspectives, we may be interpreting safety as being something completely different. So maybe if we can just start with that, then I have a couple of other questions, please.
Thank you for asking for that clarification. That I should have done that myself. So thank you for raising that.
Not at all. No criticism. It's just for all of us to be on the same page.
By that I mean that the safeguards and systems for reviewing the eligibility criteria ensure that only people who are eligible and meet those criteria are able to access voluntary assisted dying, and those who are not eligible are not able to access voluntary assisted dying. So when I talk about the system operating safely, that is what I mean. Thank you.
Okay, all right. And I suppose then that brings me very neatly into when I consider safety from this perspective of we're before legislation or even a view, before articulating a view back to our Parliament in our recommendations, the safety that I consider are things like the robustness of consent. There are other areas we're legislating for at the moment in the context of surrogacy, for instance, and we look for counselling in advance for all parties involved, legal advice. We look for the robustness of that. And yet in the context of this conversation, we have had if there is a presumption of capacity, that needs to be safeguarded. And yet we also need to safeguard to know that a person is actually freely and making these decisions. And that for me is an essential element of safety. I suppose I also am considering things like, when we say about societal claims, how actually will we test whether their perceptions have changed or not? I'm not convinced that we can. We see even in polls, political polls, we've seen the evidence in the past election that people were unwilling to say they were going to vote for President Trump in America at the first time prior to him becoming president, a change then in perception. So I think people can misrepresent themselves in polls by views, or their views change depending on what is socially acceptable. I feel that across a lot of areas. So I suppose I'm concerned that how would we ever really measure whether there had been changes in attitudes? Because that's where my concern lies. Is how do we look for that? How do we test it? And where you say there haven't been changes, how do you know that with any level of certainty? And then I'm a little confused because we have previously had evidence before us that would say that in the likes of the Netherlands and in other jurisdictions, pardon me, there is a disproportionately high number of older single women who avail of assisted dying as an option. In its various forms, regardless. So there would seem to be a trend of them being a vulnerable group, or even do we all have the same definition in our head when we talk about vulnerable groups? There's a lot of questions there for whoever wishes to come in.
Could I maybe just pick up on the training, the consent and issue that you raised, and maybe others can comment on the others. I would include that as obviously as part of eligibility criteria. So making decisions with capacity, being informed and being able to make those decisions. One of the things that I mentioned which is different about Australia is there is a mandatory requirement for all practitioners who are providing voluntary assisted dying to undertake state-approved training. And there's specific training in there on consent, there's specific training there on detection of coercion and those sorts of things. And in some of the interviews that we've done with doctors, they have actually said that the conversations that they've had about voluntary assisted dying made them realise they've been practising as doctors for 20 years. They weren't doing informed consent. They were just sort of going through a process. Having done this and really stepped through that deep decision-making process with their patients, a number of them said, I now understand what informed consent is. So I might just make those two observations.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. McLeod?
Yes, I think your points about public perception are very well made. Before New Zealand changed the law, you probably know we had a referendum, and people were asked whether they were in favour of euthanasia and assisted dying, and a majority said yes. But when people researched what they understood to be assisted dying and euthanasia, it was clear that the majority had no idea. They thought that having morphine for pain relief was assisted dying. They thought that withdrawing ventilatory support was assisted dying. There were a whole raft of things. So when people were made more aware of what assisted dying really was, the numbers in support of it came down. Now, that wasn't enough to change the way that people voted. They voted in a majority to change the law. But even some of the lawmakers that I spoke to didn't really understand the implications of what they were voting on. The rather thin safeguards that I would see in our legislation mean that, yes, our assisting medical practitioners are trained in detecting coercion. And yet when you speak to geriatricians who have a lifetime of experience with family members coercing their patients, they find it very difficult. So I don't think it's easy to say, yes, they've had some training so they know how to detect coercion. Yes, they've had some training to know how to test capacity. Testing capacity is an astonishingly difficult thing to do. And the courts are filled with people, with families who are suggesting that somebody didn't have capacity when they wrote their will, for example, and that's very difficult to challenge. So I think I'm just glad that I don't have your job of trying to create a law which is safe, because I hear what Professor White says about the safety aspects. I just don't believe that, from what I've read, that any jurisdiction has created legislation which is truly safe, that can't be got around.
Thank you.
By one way or another.
Thank you very much. I must move now.